Hey there, I'm Nick Zagar. Welcome to the Dentelligentsia Podcast. Today we have a longtime friend and a practice transitions specialist, Chris Webb from Harvest Transitions. Welcome, Chris. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thank you for having me too.
Yeah, no, we're super excited to have you, especially because our professional paths have crossed in the past, and within the past couple years, you started your own company, Harvest Transitions. Talk to us about that. Tell us more about it.
Yeah. So I started in commercial healthcare real estate. And so doing just the commercial real estate aspect of it, really, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being able to help people. I think, the motto was like helping people that help people. It's a great service to be able to provide. For me, it felt a little transactional. So the relationships were fairly quick. Our goal was to go in and negotiate a lease renewal, negotiate a new location or a purchase, and then we were kind of out. So a handful of years ago, I was able to move into a brokerage that offered the practice transitions. So I was there for a little while and then decided it was time to move out on my own. And so I started Harvest Transitions a little over a year ago. And really, I love what I do. I love being able to help doctors with, I'm on both ends of the spectrum. So I'm helping a seller be able to sell their practice and retire, which was their long-term goal anyway. And then also help younger doctors be able to buy a practice and start their ownership. And that long-term relationship is really what gets me excited. And I stay in contact with clients and, I hear about what they're doing in retirement, where they're traveling and what kind of fun hobbies they're doing. And then with the newer doctors, what changes are they making in their practice and what growth are they seeing and being able to celebrate those victories with them.
Yeah, that's super cool. I mean, our professional careers, I think our missions are probably pretty similar in that we really want to build strong relationships with our clients and help them through the challenging situations that they have navigating their businesses. Talk to us about a success story where your involvement really, created a significant difference in a dentist transition from end of their career to, selling their legacy and for all intents and purposes, riding off into the sunset.
Yeah. So it's hard to think about that where, my participation was a huge difference maker because I prefer to kind of be working in the background and allow, the doctors to kind of be the hero in the story. But I can think of a time where that long-term mindset and longevity in the relationship has really been beneficial. I was working with a client in a rural area in northern Michigan. So it was hard to get a young doctor to see the benefit of moving outside of like a bigger city. Right. And so, working with the doctor, we had a handful of just things that were pretty traumatic for him. So at one point he had some health issues and so had decided like, hey, let's just sell the paper charts. Let's get rid of, let's get rid of whatever we can. I just can't do it because I've got these health issues. And then once he regained his health, he had like his staff all left together because they were worried he wasn't going to be able to sell it because of his health. So then he had to restaff the whole office and, we stuck it out together. I went and visited him. I stayed on I talked to him on the phone, kept encouraging him. We helped try to help, find staff for the office and kept talking to buyers. And eventually we found somebody that did see the value of being a more rural office, having that lower overhead, being out of the big city. And really, to be honest, it ended up being the perfect situation, the perfect buyer for the perfect practice. And he's actually there now. He's, the buyer, he's there. He's been there for a couple of years. He loves the practice. He loves the building. He loves the location in the area. His family's all up there and he's become our personal dentist for our family. So, when I talk to a doctor, especially in a rural area, you always try to prepare them for, it's going to be a long process, right? If you're not in Grand Rapids, if you're not in Detroit, and then maybe in Lansing, you're going to have a tough time finding a buyer willing to go there. And so you got to plan on it being a little bit slower, a little bit longer, but I'm in it for the long haul because my goal is to see your dreams come true of being able to sell the practice and find the right buyer to take that practice over so you can be proud of the legacy that you've built for your patients and your staff. And that it's going to be carried forward really well. And typically for a seller, they do care who's going to take over because that's typically going to be their dentist as well. So you want to know that when you're going in for your own treatments, that it's somebody you trust and respect and appreciate carrying your name and your legacy forward.
I can imagine that selling a practice can be a incredibly emotional process for a late career dentist. I mean, they've essentially, whether they're in a bigger city, a more suburban location, or a more rural location, they're really a fixture in that community, and that their patient base is essentially, you know, it's not their family, but it is, it may feel like it's an extension of their family because they've spent a lot of time and many years and watched those families grow and move on and flourish, and all the ups and downs of life, and then it's time to retire and move on, and they have built this legacy and they have built this incredible community. How do you guide them through both of the business and emotional aspects of letting go?
Yeah, it's because you're absolutely right. A lot of the doctors, that I've worked with, they're seeing fourth and fifth generations of family members. So it's like I treated your great grandpa, your grandpa, your parents, your kids, and so they're seeing these families, and they feel more like friendships than they do patients a lot of the time. It's a very emotional process because it's like a baby that you've built, whether they started it up from scratch or they bought it from somebody else and took it over, but they've poured their life into it for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So it is a very emotional process. I think the biggest thing is just trying to walk them through ahead of time or prepare them, right? Typically in my process, I'll have an initial call with a doctor. If they feel good about it and I feel good about working together, I'll send them over a document to collect a bunch of information. And I usually will warn them that is typically that first time where it becomes real, right? Like in our household, potential is a bad word because, you can talk about potential and dream and live off of potential. You can spend potential, but until it's actually there, that's all it ever is, right? It's just potential. It's just a wish or a hope. And so, the potential idea of selling your practice is just kind of this idea out there. But when you start filling out paperwork and you start giving in, financials and practice reports, and you're giving information on your staff and on your patients, that's that first dose of reality. Like, whoa, wait a minute, this is getting real really quickly. And so I typically will warn them, you're going to start this process and it's going to hit. And when it does, give me a call and let's talk about it again. Let's make sure that everything's okay and that you're moving forward. I've had doctors take a week to get me that report, and I've had them take months because they just aren't ready to pull the trigger. The second time, again, because of potential, the second time it really gets real is when you get an offer, when you get an LOI or a letter of intent on your practice, and all of a sudden that time frame hits. They want to close in 60 days or 90 days. It's like it's another reality that kicks in. And so we talk about, what are your hobbies? What are your outside interests? What other things do you like to do outside of dentistry? Because at that point, if dentistry is your whole life, then you've got nothing to look forward to. So then we need to figure out, okay, what is that going to be?
Well, before we get deep into the weeds of some of the intricacies of how you help dentists on these transitions, why don't you tell us a little bit more about some of the kind of compliments that you've gotten recently, or has there been any great feedback that you've gotten from some of your clients when you've basically helped them hold their hand through that journey? What is their response like?
Yeah, so a lot of the times, I think the most flattering feedback you can get is when somebody introduces you to their whole family. Somebody wants you to meet their spouse. They want you to meet their children. They want you to meet their grandchildren. And they're excited to introduce you to them because they kind of bring you into their family through the process. Great compliment is when somebody is willing to introduce you to a friend or a colleague and say, hey, you should really work with Chris. He helped me so much. Here are the things that he did for me. And I know he's going to be able to take care of you. Those are the things that I thrive on. Those are the things that are the most meaningful, just being willing to stick with somebody to go through the whole process to help them, find the right person or the right practice, whether they're a buyer or a seller. Those compliments, and like I said, I'm not the hero of the story, but it is always humbling for somebody to say, oh, I could have never done this without you. I never could have made it through without you. That's the kind of stuff where, it really is a service. It's not just a job.
I can really relate to that. I mean, we feel, I think, kindred spirits in that way. And really it's like, we're there as a trusted advisor to help answer questions, relieve anxieties, and really give good data so that the hero of the story can make the best business decision for themselves at that time.
Yeah, I think the thing that, like, you guys do a great job with it as well is, you know, you're making a really big decision, whether it's a once in a lifetime, twice in a lifetime, maybe a few times in a lifetime decision. It's a really big deal. We're talking about, a lot of money. We're talking about a lot of debt, a lot of stress. And with that, our job, and I think you guys do a really good job with it too, is I just want you to make an educated an educated decision, not educated guess, but an educated decision on what you're getting yourself into. Can you understand as much of it as can possibly be understood ahead of time, so that when you make that decision, at the end of the day that it's worth the hard work.
Yeah, but an educated client makes better decisions. Poorly educated client, that's a fact. Talk to me about some of the red flags that a dentist who's at the end of their career and they're evaluating the financial health of their practice before a sale. What should they be watching out for? What should they be thinking about?
I think the biggest thing that's lacking is the doctors being involved in the financials and within their practice software. What's being input to their production and their collection. They're like, oh, my CPA handles the financials, my office manager handles this, my front desk handles that, and they don't really get involved. So I think the biggest thing that I'll tell a doctor when they're ready to start thinking about retirement is, if you have not, you need to get yourself thoroughly involved in the financials of your practice. So you need to know, what is your overall production? What is the collection that you're getting from those productions? Because you're going to have write-offs for insurance and patients that don't pay and things like that. But what is actually coming in? And then, where are your overhead numbers? Something that you can scare away buyers with is a really high overhead. So you can have a $2 million practice in Grand Rapids, which you think you would sell within a week. But if you've got really high overhead and there's just not enough income to cover the debt service for the loan for the practice, you're never going to be able to sell that practice. So you've got to have an idea of where your overhead is, and then where are things out of line within the industry standards. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And we can go as deep into the weeds on that as you want.
Well,
or we can leave it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. As you were speaking, I had a couple of thoughts come to mind. And then what I was contemplating was, the world has changed, and it's seemingly changing incredibly fast before our eyes. And a lot of the dentists who maybe started their career in the 70s or the 80s, or maybe even the early 90s, they may not be practicing the same way somebody is practicing today. And so I wonder if you come across challenges from situations like that, where it's really hard to kind of somebody who would be wanting to buy a practice may be expecting a more up-to-date facility or equipment or software. And how does that translate these days in a negotiation or just a sale transaction?
Yeah. So that gets tough. So if you go into an office of a doctor who's looking to sell their practice and retire, you don't want to go in and say, okay, you need to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars to upgrade everything because your equipment is original. You don't have digital charts, you don't have digital x-rays, like you're still processing film. And you don't want to go in and say, okay, spend all of this money so that we can sell your practice, because a lot of the investment probably isn't going to get a return. So, what I would tell somebody is, if you're thinking about retirement, you really should be in that like 5 to 8 years ahead of time. Make sure that you don't allow things like, in real estate, we talk to clients about deferred maintenance, right? On a building or in a space, like things that should have been taken care of that just have kind of they've kind of let slide for too long. And then they become an issue down the road. So if you've got equipment that isn't functioning properly, you have to get it repaired properly. You have to get it replaced. Right now, the biggest issue that buyers are looking at is they need to have digital x-rays. They don't want to be using film. They don't want to use, phosphorus plates on a ScanX. They want to be able to take digital x-rays, have computers in every operatory, and they'd love to have digital paper, they'd like to have digital charts and not paper charts, because the process of scanning those charts in is very laborious and time taking. So if you're that far ahead, if you're 5 to 8 years out, it'd be a great time to start implementing some of those things and making sure that your office has that, making sure that things around the building aren't, falling apart. Because every item that a buyer sees that they want to replace, they're mentally knocking down the price of the practice so that they can replace it.
That's really interesting. Great and great advice, because I think a majority of people, they invest their time and their energy focusing on serving their patients, and less so, the perfect transition out. And so
Right.
they're really in uncharted territory when they're selling their practice. And so, from your experience, because you've done dozens and dozens and dozens of these types of transactions, what are the biggest fears that they have, people in these positions?
So sellers, the biggest fear is that they won't be able to find somebody to sell the practice. It's very typical in the dental field for a doctor to wait too long or to not do any investing in their retirement, thinking that the sale of their practice is going to be their retirement. But if you've allowed yourself to get to the point where you're slowing down because you're tired, you're financially stable and secure, and so you start to take more time off, or you start to take more days off, your practice starts to produce less, it's going to affect the price that you can sell it for. And at that point, you're not going to get as much from the practice. So if you're 100% reliant on selling the practice for retirement, you put yourself in a pretty tough situation. So, if a doctor, buys a practice, my recommendation would be, start putting money away for investment right away. Get yourself a financial planner, so that you can start to work on that ahead of time, so that when it comes time for retirement, if your retirement is not dependent on the sale of your practice, it's like those car salesmen, right? You go in and when you're talking to somebody, you can feel when they're desperate to get a sale, right? That desperation just reeks, and it's very off-putting. So if you can go into it and your retirement, your livelihood is not dependent on the sale of your practice, you don't have that desperation. And for some reason, there is just that attraction to that practice because you're not desperate to sell it. You're just ready to retire when you can sell it. Does that answer the question?
I think that's, that's really helpful, because, no, you need to really, it's like, we don't think of it in our world, but when people are doing a startup, not a dental startup, but they're like, doing a technology startup, their focus is really the exit. They're planning the exit before they even build their product. But it's a lot different in the case of somebody whose mission is their community's oral health and just their community in general. And so it's really good advice. Are there any other common mistakes that you see dentists making, or are there other things that you'd mention to avoid some of those pitfalls?
Yeah. So other than not updating the office and not keeping things up to date, doesn't need to be completely tech savvy, but just updated, not watching your overhead, but just looking at things and using your reps as teammates, right? So you're like things that are easier to control are, like your supplies. You can control your supplies by talking to, the rep that you enjoy working with the most. And instead of splitting it equally, buying, 30% of your supplies from this company, 30% from this company, 30% from this company, and then 10% online, if you buy a majority of them from one company, first of all, you can typically get more efficiency and save more money. But then second, you can tell them, hey, I really want my supplies to be, 5, 6, 7, 8% of my collections. And I want it to be under control. And so I'm going to employ you as a teammate for my office. And if somebody starts to order too many supplies that are expiring because they're just hanging out on the shelf, you need to take control of that because I'm trusting you to be a partner with it. But there are different things like that you can do to help control that overhead. And then, like I've seen where the overhead has gotten so out of control, it's 80 to 85% of the collections. And then you've got the doctor saying, okay, well, I've made enough money and I don't need the income. And so there are a couple of staff members in the office making more than the doctor, which is fine for you as a seller if you don't really need the income. The problem comes when, there's $60,000 for a buying doctor and they've got $500,000 of student loan debt. They've got their own personal debt that they're trying to pay, and then they're going to take on a loan to pay for the practice. So now they're losing money to own a dental office. Like, you're just never going to sell that.
Yeah.
So, that's where overhead is something you really do have to control. And my recommendation would be not to go through and just start cutting everybody's pay and, wrecking the goodwill that you've created with staff members, but also not allowing the staff to run the practice.
That's a good segue into the next, my next volley of questions, which is really, if I was a new dentist and I was interested in buying a practice, I'd want to really understand, and get to know the staff that was in place, because, you're going to be working together really, really closely. And, I would want to understand the dynamics, who runs the roost, and really get to know that culture. Because, once you buy the practice, and if there is a kind of a shifty or the culture isn't great, or there's somebody who's domineering within the practice, you want to be able to work with that. But, also the new dentist would want to kind of create their own, I would imagine, take the best from what's existing, but build upon it. How do you help from either aspect, that consideration for office culture?
Yeah, well, it's huge, right? The environment of the office is going to make or break how that office treats patients, how they treat each other. Patients can feel whether or not there's tension within the office, right? Within the staff, you can only hide so much. So typically what I would recommend is, you want to have it be as much of a done deal as possible, because you don't want to just start introducing, any buyer, buyer Joe or Jackie to the staff if you don't have a contract in place, if you don't have a asset purchase agreement or APA in place, because you're moving forward, you both have attorneys that have worked on it. Because if they fall apart and they walk away, now you've got to introduce somebody else, and staff, there's a lot of uncertainty. So typically, people hate change. People are afraid of change. You want to, like, a seller needs to inform staff at some point. They don't want to do it too early, but they also don't want to do it the day or week before, day of. I've heard of offices where a doctor shows up, hey, by the way, I just want to let you know I sold the practice. Here's the new dentist. He's taking over, and then leaving. And so, even a week before doesn't really feel like enough time. But the seller really does need to inform staff and let them know, hey, here's what's going on. Allow staff to kind of ask some questions. Their biggest fear is going to always be, okay, how secure is my job? Human nature, you're going to be concerned about your own job. So then allowing for the buyer to come in and to meet with the staff, my recommendation 100% of the time is bring in some food. It could be something as simple as, pizza. You could have them order, Jimmy John's or Subway or whatever, but bring in some food and break some bread together. First of all, it always breaks the ice. Second of all, it always has that intended feeling of building a family, right? Building a relationship together because you're breaking bread. And then it allows them to kind of warm up. They can ask you questions about, what sort of technology you plan on bringing in the office. That always gets staff excited if you're planning on upgrading your technology. You know, what sort of procedures you're bringing in. You know, a lot of assistants especially will be excited if you're going to bring in endo, you know, or you're going to bring in some oral surgery, or you're going to be doing implants. They get to be part of something they haven't been a part of before. So if you're bringing in new treatments, you know, to the office, they're going to be really excited about that. And then they're going to want to know about you personally. So I always tell a buyer to prepare, like, hey, be prepared to tell them about, you know, your family if you have one. Tell them about yourself, your interests, your hobbies, because they want to get to know you in a way where they don't see you as the monster coming in to get ready to fire them. And then, you know, my recommendation is always, you know, try to keep the staff members. You know, keep every staff member in that office that you can, keep them. The only exception would be if somebody is toxic to the work environment. So you walk in and somebody, you know, is basically dominating, like you had mentioned, like just domineering the whole work environment and the atmosphere. At that point, you've got to make a quick decision. And, you know, you want to be slow to hire, quick to fire. And so I know that you didn't hire that staff because they were there and you kind of inherited them. But I can't tell you how many times I've talked to doctors after they've owned a practice for a few months. They had to let somebody go. It was really tough. But, you know, the environment in the office has changed and is so much more positive because that person was very toxic and treated it as if they were running the office instead of the doctor. So they had no deference to the leadership change. And it really does make a big difference. It makes everything more positive, and staff members are relieved that that person is gone. That's hopefully not the case in every transition, but you do have to be quick with that, because otherwise you're going to lose every other staff member because they're not going to stay.
It's really good advice. Let's talk about the patient experience, because at the end of the day, that's, I think, the most important thing, probably to the outgoing doctor, to the, you know, to the new dentist who's taking over the practice, is you want to ensure a smooth and painless transition. What tips would you give, or would you advise people to think about to ensure that?
Hopefully through the process, you know, a buyer and seller have gotten together a few times. So typically what I've recommended, and I've worked with other brokers where we've co-brokered, you know, I've worked with the seller and they've worked with the buyer, or they've worked with the seller and I've worked with the buyer. And so typically in the transition world, you want those doctors to meet up and talk at least a few times. And that first time should always just be about your philosophy of dentistry, of your philosophy of patient treatment planning. And so you kind of just get to know each other that way, so that before you start getting down the road of making an offer and accepting an offer and having attorneys get involved, you feel pretty comfortable about who's going to be, you know, whose practice you're going to take over, and whose practice, you know, who's going to be taking over your practice from those perspectives. At that point, you know, if you're willing to accept an offer for somebody, hopefully you're excited about them. So to help with that patient transition, once everything's ready to go and you've informed staff, because they should always hear before your patients, you know, you should have informed staff. Staff should have been able to meet the buyer. And at that point, then you guys can openly talk about it with patients. So you should, you know, as a seller, you should be like very excited and telling patients like, hey, I'm really excited. I found the right person to take over. You're going to love them. They're a great dentist. They're a great person. They're so kind, and they're going to be gentle. They're going to treat you like family. You should be just exhorting that doctor to patients as you're talking to them. And then as treatment plans come up, you know, if it's a longer term treatment plan, then you should defer that to that buyer. So you can say, oh, this is what I think, but I think you should really talk to the buying doctor coming in, because they're going to be the ones taking care of you, because this process is going to be longer than, you know, I'm planning on hanging out. You should send out a patient letter to patients to inform them of it, to inform them that you're excited about bringing them in, to try to pass that trust on to patients for the doctor that you're bringing in, because, you know, you've handpicked them, and making sure that actually does get out in time for patients to have it and to have an idea. I'll tell you of a horror story with that in just a second. But the other thing that's a really cool touch for a buyer is the first little while that you're in the office, start calling patients ahead of time for their appointment with you, to let them know that you're there, that you hope that they got the letter introducing you, but that you can't wait to meet them and to treat them and to take care of them. and that you've heard so much from, Dr. So-and-so about how wonderful they are and how you know how to take care of them and take care of their oral health needs. And that personal touch is going to make a big difference. And I learned that through the horror story. So we went through a practice transition. I helped the buyer. We wrote a letter introducing them. The seller was supposed to write a letter, kind of like introducing the idea of them retiring. And then it was supposed to be sent out. We were led to believe that was sent out 1 to 2 weeks before closing, which is a pretty tight window, but we were at least told that it was sent out. Come to find out, it was never printed. It was never sent out to a single patient. So buying doctor called me. He was my client in that transaction. He called me after his first 2 appointments and he said, "Hey, the patient letter was never sent out. What do I do?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean it wasn't sent out?" He said, "He never printed it and never sent it out." My first patient showed up. It was 4 extractions and he had no idea that I was even here. He was expecting the other doctor. So he's like, I'm here pulling teeth on this guy. He has no idea who I am. He doesn't even know my name. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, that's super scary as a patient, but then also as a doctor, like, thanks a lot that you set me up for success here. So we talked about it and I said, if you've got time in between appointments, just start calling patients and letting them know, just start calling them and saying, "Hey, it's Susie Hugh. This is Dr. So-and-so. And I just want to let you know, I bought Dr. So-and-so's practice and super excited. You've got an appointment scheduled here. I'm really excited to be able to meet you and to be able to help you." And so he started to do that and he started to call them out, like 1 or 2 weeks ahead of time. And he got the most amazing feedback from patients that he took the time to call them personally and actually even got Google reviews from it of patients letting people know how wonderful he was and how personable he was, because he took the time to call them ahead of their appointment. And so it was at that point, I'm like, okay, that needs to be like a new standard, operating procedure. But, that you try to do everything you can to make that transition, but both parties have got to be involved. Both parties have got to hold up their end of the bargain.
Finding the right buyer for your practice, I'm sure, is crucial. How do you ensure that a dentist sells their practice with somebody that aligns with their values and patient care philosophy? I don't really, take us behind the curtain because I don't know, or for anybody who's thinking about selling, I don't know what that process is like, if they actually have multiple buyers or multiple offers at the same time, or you meet multiple people, or how take us behind the curtain.
Yeah. So the process starts with me, through my introduction and through doing a practice valuation and things like that. I get to know the seller and I get to know them fairly personally. So my job initially is to be that filter. So as people reach out and share interest, whether they reach out to the seller directly or they reach out to me through, whether it be a vendor partner or through my website or marketing, or they're just calling, looking for practice opportunities, I will typically ask them questions and get to know them a little bit so I know what kind of, what there are. Are you focused on producing? Are you doing procedures that you're uncomfortable with because they're going to make money? Or are you doing things that you're comfortable with and you've done a lot of training on? You've done a lot of CE? Are you patient first or are you production first? Is your main focus on how much money you're going to make, or is it, on patient care? And so you kind of match up some of those personality traits. And if you get somebody and you really do get this feeling that, it's not very often, but every once in a while you talk to somebody and you're like, you really only care about money. Like that's all it is for you, is you just want to make money. So you don't care if you're over treating patients because you can bill for it and make money on it. That's your only focus. And those ones you kind of graciously push out to the side.
Let me interrupt real quick, because this is an interesting, there's kind of, it's like a balance, maybe, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe that buyer, maybe more maybe money might be more important, because they have to somehow pay for it and juggle all the other expenses that they have in their life. How do you manage that brain damage between those two?
That chasm is huge. And you're right, because you do have to be mindful of it. So when I do a practice valuation, I do check, okay, what is the debt service going to be on the practice loan? What is the debt service going to be if they buy the real estate on the real estate loan? And then what is that income left at the end of the day for them to be able to provide for their family? Because if you can't provide for your family, it doesn't make sense, right? So I don't mean to say it in a way, thank you for catching me on that. Like buyers are greedy and they're awful, right? That's why I was trying to say like it's very rare, but you do find like I want a doctor to go in and to bring in some new procedures to an office and increase the profitability. I want them to increase the production because they're willing to work more, or they're a little bit faster than an older doctor who's slowed down. They're willing to be a little bit more aggressive in their treatment planning, where instead of watching something that, watching a cracked tooth, instead of like offering to do a crown for it, like, yeah, I want you to be able to do those things. What I'm more concerned about is, a doctor who is, doing things that are unnecessary, where you go in and you've got something that could be taken care of with a filling, or doesn't even need a filling yet, but they're treatment planning it to try to get it done to be able to get paid. So a good example of that is why we change dentists, right? Our personal dentist, our daughter went in, she went from having like great, like everything looks really good, her teeth look really good, we don't have anything we're watching, to the next point we showed up and they're like, hey, we got 7 spots that we really feel like we need to take care of. And I'm like, okay, as a parent, my kid's always the best. She's always the healthiest. She does, a great job with all of it, right? So like, I know I'm very jaded towards my daughter, right? I'm gonna be on her side, but I just kept thinking like, it's very suspicious. And so I asked for the x-rays, and I brought it to my new dentist, my friend. And I said, hey, I need to take a look. If this is real, we'll do it. But I don't want to do work that's unnecessary, especially in her baby teeth, right? And he took a look and he was like, to be honest with you, I'd do more damage to her teeth to take care of these 6 things than what I would do any benefit for her, because it hasn't even broken the enamel. And I'm like, okay, cool. That language went over my head, right? But like, okay, cool. I get the concept of it. And he's like, this one, we really probably should take care of, and we'll take care of it at the next appointment. And so, there's that difference of like, how aggressive are you treatment planning? Are you over treatment planning? Again, because you've got money there that people will take, that people will do. And so, you try to root out who's going to take advantage of people and who's going to take care of people. Now, if my friend had said like, hey, all 7 of these do need to be taken care of, okay, then let's take care of them, right? But I want to know that they need to be taken care of as a patient. I want to know that it needs to be taken care of, and not just, hey, this is very preemptive and I'm very early on. That's what you're trying to find out. You want somebody who's going to take care of things that are necessary, not things that are unnecessary, because you can bill for it.
Well, it's very easy for people like me and you to say this because we live and breathe inside of the dental community. But for people that don't, they don't know what to believe, and so they have to trust the person that's that's looking out for their oral health, their dentist. And so that is something that people need to be aware of, and a good reason for a selling dentist to really dig in and learn more about who they're selling their practice to.
Yeah, it's I want to clarify again. It's definitely not common to find somebody like that. Most of the time, you've gone to school 8 years to become a dentist, right? So you've rooted out enough people that are just in it for the money. It's a very profitable business still, which is why people do it, right? Like, you take on a sacrifice of 8 years of schooling. A lot of the younger kids now are graduating with $500,000 in debt, student loan debt. They haven't even started their family, right? You're talking about they're going to want to buy a house. They're going to want to upgrade their college hoopty car. They're going to want to have nice clothes and to be able to do fun things and be able to have a life. And so, there's definitely the reward available, but you just want to find somebody that genuinely has a care for their patients, if that's your style. Now, if your style is you're out just rocking out procedures and making money, then you don't really care who's taking over, right? Then that's not even a conversation that you're looking at. But again, it's so few and far in between that typically it's, what I always tell my clients is, just trust the process, because we're going to find the right person. The right person will come along. And if you're a person of faith, you just have to believe that, God's going to work things out for the good of those who love him. Right. And so the right person is going to come along with the right personality, the right philosophy of dentistry. And when you meet that person, it makes the whole process so much less scary. right? And everybody involved then gets to be excited. And what I always tell them is, I've done my job properly if we get to the closing table and you're just as excited about the process as you were at that very first introduction. And if you're not, then I've failed in the process of educating you along the way so that you can be excited about handing that baton over.
What's one piece of advice you'd give to a mid-career dentist who is really not ready to sell, but wants to set them up for success in a future transition, maybe 15, 20 years down the road?
Yeah. So a weird one for you that a lot of people don't think about, but is, if you're leasing the real estate, then you're leasing the real estate. It is what it is. You're going to want to keep track of when that lease comes up for a renewal. Find an expert like Mirlo, right? Where you guys are going to be able to take care of them and help them negotiate that lease renewal. You have a lot of negotiating power that people don't think, right? They don't think about. So get somebody to help you negotiate those lease renewals when that lease comes up. And because leasing is what it is. If you own the real estate, pay yourself rent. Find out what market rent is, what a market rate is, and pay yourself. I get a lot of pushback from CPAs on it because financially it doesn't make a difference, but the optics of it make a huge difference. So if I'm talking to a buyer and we're looking at a practice, I'm able to pull out different expenses that are more personal, right? To show what is the actual like cash flow of the office. We're gonna be able to take out like whatever the selling doctor is writing off for cell phone, for travel, for meals and entertainment, for CE, things that aren't necessarily going to have to transfer over, but could, right? Depreciation, amortization, interest, those are all things that are getting written off that aren't an actual deficit to the practice. So let's pull those out and let's find out what your actual cash flow is. Now, when I look at it with a buyer and I say, okay, this is the price that we have on the practice. Here's what your debt service is going to be. Your loan payments are going to be. So now we're going to take that out of that net cash flow. Okay. And you're also going to buy the real estate. And here's what that real estate debt service is going to be. We're going to take that out of the cash flow. Now we're ending up with this number that's taking out debt service because they want to know, what can I live off of? Well, there's a huge advantage if I say, hey, by the way, here's what the purchase price is for the real estate, and here's what the debt service is. And the practice owner has been paying themselves rent, and that number matches up with what that debt service is going to be, or it's higher or lower. But now we don't have to take as much out of your cash flow because the office has already been paying an amount of money towards real estate. And it's a huge benefit. The less numbers I have to take out of cash flow, the happier a buyer is. So, it's the optics of it, but it does make a difference. So paying yourself a market rate, and I say market rate because if you're way over inflating your rent because you think it's going to make, your building worth so much more money, that it doesn't help anybody, right? You haven't done any good. And if you way underpay, then you haven't taken enough out to cover any of that debt service value. So I would say like that's one oddity that mid-career dentist should take care of. And then the second thing would be to stay involved. Like stay involved in the finances of your practice, stay involved in the day-to-day operations, track your production, track your collection, see if there's a way to improve those, to make sure you're getting as much money from your work as you possibly can. Keep up with having somebody negotiate your fees with insurance companies. Delta Dental owns a monopoly, and you're not going to be able to negotiate that with them. And the younger dentists are going to take a huge hit. So, a Delta Premier doctor is a doctor that graduated, before 2014. 2014 and after, they're now considered a PPO, which overall just means that any Delta patient that comes in, whatever that other doctor was writing off, you can anticipate writing off an additional 20 to 25%. So if you're doing a $100 treatment and the selling doctor is an older doctor, they're a premier doctor, they're getting $65 for their $100 treatment, you can plan on getting 45 or 50. So, just making sure that you're negotiating the fees and the other insurances that you can to keep those higher to make sure that you're getting as much money as possible. Let's see it in a doctor's pocket and not in an insurance company's pocket. So keep an eye on those things mid-career so that at the end, your office can be set up to be successfully transitioned to a buyer.
I got two more questions before we can get into some more fun stuff and personal stuff and some reflection. But EBITDA, for those people who are out there and they have never heard that word or they don't understand it, you want to explain it in layperson's terms so that they can kind of understand what that means and why it's important to them?
Yeah. So EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So it's, before you start paying your taxes, depreciation, things like that you're writing off, what are your earnings in the office? EBITDA is a great number to be thrown around. Typically, if a CPA does any sort of valuation on the practice, they're going to focus on EBITDA. And then once you find that EBITDA, it's your, again, it's that earnings number that somebody is planning on having. That's always tied to a multiple. So when somebody is looking at a practice and, it's an owner of a practice, mid-career, end of career, whatever, and somebody starts talking EBITDA and multiples, my first question is always, is your plan to sell it to corporate or is it your plan to sell it to a private doctor? Because EBITDA doesn't apply to a private doctor. It's for a corporate sale, and it's because that's what those DSOs and corporate entities have factored their prices on, is they're going to calculate EBITDA. They're typically going to give you a lower EBITDA than what like a broker or a CPA would give you, right? Because they have their things that they'll take out because they want to pay less, right? And then they're going to give you this high multiple. They're going to give you seven times your EBITDA, 4 times your EBITDA, 5 times your, whatever it is, 10 times your EBITDA, whatever the numbers they throw out there are. Then they're going to find ways that they can try to knock that price down, right? So the offer is going to be really high. Then they're going to knock down that price. If you're selling private doctor to private doctor, EBITDA is a tough one to use, again, because the idea behind it is to get as much money as possible out of the practice. Where if you're selling to a private doctor, they're going to want to know what the value of the practice is based on the actual collections. So it's going to be a multiple, but that multiple is going to be a percentage under 100% of what the practice is actually collecting, which is where a bank is going to give you approval. Right? So you want to know, okay, if the practice is collecting, for easy number's sake, the practice is collecting $1 million, you're going to want to pay a percentage of that $1 million, right? So if $1 million practice has an EBITDA of 250,000 or 300,000 and you're offering 2 or 3 or 4x, you can calculate the price. But if you get over 100%, you've now made your practice unfinanceable, right? It's probably not even a word, but like, a bank can't finance a practice over 100%. They're just not going to be able to. And so if you're desperately trying to get over 100% of your collections, you're going to carry a seller's note. And at that point, a buyer's got to be comfortable knowing they're paying more than what a bank will actually finance. Banks will typically max out at like 90% of collections, right? But that 90% needs to include working capital, which is money given to a doctor to be able to keep the operations going while they're waiting for collections to come in. They can use that to buy accounts receivable if they're purchasing the accounts receivable. They can use it to buy any equipment that they would like to do or technology like that they'd like to add. So they'll get the purchase price plus working capital. And then if you're selling real estate, they can use any amount left up to that 90% financing to cover the down payment of the real estate so they can get 100% financing for the practice in the real estate. So the higher you get into that 90%, the closer you get to that 90%, the less money they have available for things like working capital, any equipment, and then also the down payment towards the real estate. So that's where, like, for me, my valuation process is always based on a percentage of collections, and different things factor into it. How profitable is the practice? Where is the practice located? What condition is the office in? What condition is the equipment in? And then what condition is the staffing in?
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. My last question, a little bit of an oddball question, but maybe not that oddball. It's within the genre of what we've been discussing, but it's like, let's say I'm a late career dentist. I was working 4 or 5 days a week in the past. Now I'm working 3 days a week. I'm thinking about, I'm at the twilight of my career. I don't want to bust my hump. I want to take it easy. I want to go to the, spend some time at the lake, go to a Tigers game, what have you. And, how do people in that situation, I mean, is it, they're likely not at the point of their career where they're trying to really attract new patients all the time. But what is the balance between them, having a vibrant practice that can sell for more, and trading that, with the lifestyle at their current, place in life.
Yeah, that's tough, because an office working 3 days a week, doing no marketing probably isn't going to be super exciting to a younger doctor unless you can get them to understand, hey, you've got more opportunity by adding a fourth day because you're used to working 4 days. There's no marketing. So now you can grow the practice by doing simple things like just getting a website in place that's going to build some SEO, doing some social media, so there's a lot of growth potential there. If you're in a situation, you're at the twilight of your career, you want to cut down, you want to work 3 days a week, you don't want to be, like you said, busting your hump, and you want to be able to enjoy the lifestyle that you've tried to create for yourself. I think, you kind of have to come to grips with the idea that you're not going to get top dollar for your practice. You're going to have to take a little bit of a hit on it, unless in those 3 days you really are busting it, right? Like I've got a practice right now that's working 3 days a week. They're collecting $1.3 to $1.4 million on those 3 days with very little overhead because of it. And so it's super profitable. Okay, that's an amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
I can make, $500,000 or $600,000 a year working 3 days a week. That's amazing. It's not typically the case though, when you start to slow down. So you just have to realize that, you've worked your hardest, you've worked your butt off, and you want to enjoy your life. I'm all for that, right? Like not to get like too deep and too personal on it, but like my dad passed away at 63. So he never got to enjoy retirement, right? But he worked his butt off to get there. So I have nothing against slowing down and enjoying life. I want people, that's part of what I'm passionate about when doctors are ready to retire. Like, I want you to enjoy the life my dad didn't get to, right? And so like I'm passionate about it. But you just have to understand that every action has a reaction. Everything you do is going to have a consequence, good and bad. So if you want to slow down, but no, it's going to be maybe a little bit harder to sell, and you maybe have to make a little bit less money on it. It's the harsh reality.
Switching gears, Chris, talk to me about the best advice you've ever received.
I'll try to give you the PG.
We don't do PG around here, Chris. We don't do PG. We go with whatever, I don't think there's any kids watching this show.
So my dad's advice to my brother and I was always, anything worth doing half-ass is worth doing wholeheartedly. And so like he was a truck driver. He worked 60 hours a week all the way until he was 63 and passed. Like, he worked his butt off for us. He always took care of us and took care of my mom. And so that work ethic, was always like, hey, anything that you're willing to do, just half-heartedly, like, just go all in. Just do it all the way.
Whole ass.
Yep. Don't half-ass it.
I suspect maybe he used different language, but either way, we get the point. My dad had, I would say, if you were interviewing me, I would have a very similar advice, is that if it's worth doing, and you're going to do it the best you can. That's what my dad was.
Yeah.
That's really,
that
really
was
cool.
that was his advice, and it resonates everywhere. Right? White collar, blue collar, it resonates everywhere.
Speaking of your parents, how would your dad have described what do you do for a living?
I think so I'm gonna tell you what my mom would say. Okay. And then I think my dad would be a little bit more accurate. But my mom cracks me up because, she kind of hears what she wants. And then I'm the oldest, right? So like there's always rose-colored glasses on it. So my mom would tell you I'm a realtor, I'm a numbers guy, and I help people with businesses. Don't honestly know that she would even connect that it's like dental offices, even though I helped her go to see my friend for some dental work that she needed. Like I don't know that she'd even make that connection, but like that, it's like, to her, I'm the numbers guy. So if she's got questions about anything going on, it's like, hey, I need help with some numbers. Here's this. Can you do this for me real quick? Sometimes it's like crazy calculations, and I'm like, yeah, let me get a calculator. I'm not that smart. But in her mind, I can do all of it, right? I think my dad would have told you, like, yeah, he helps people buy and sell dental practices. Don't know that he would give you a whole lot more details, but like, he'd tell you that and he'd be super proud of it.
Chris, describe your perfect day. If you had one day left on Earth, how would you spend it?
So I think my perfect day, and if I had one day left, would be a little bit different. I think, and the main difference would be if I knew I had one day left, I'd be very, very strategic with it. And the initial time would be with my wife and daughter, just making sure that they knew how much I loved them, how valuable they were to me, how much they mean to me, and to reassure them that through our hope in Christ that we're going to see each other again in heaven. I would be very clear on that. Then the rest of the day would be just like a perfect day, right? Like we would do whatever those girls wanted. Like, what do you want to do? Let's go do it. Like my daughter loves shopping at Hobby Lobby, right? Like we'd go to Hobby Lobby and we'd spend an hour at Hobby Lobby picking out decorations for her because she loves to wreck my wife's decorations and redecorate the house. And I just let her go to town, right? Like my wife loves going to Florida. And so we'd probably find a last minute flight and fly down to Florida and go to the beach, right? And just kind of get out. But we do that. It'd be like what do the girls want to do? Let's go have some fun. That I think that would be like the perfect day, knowing that at that point I didn't have responsibilities. I didn't have a business to run. I didn't have clients to take care of because it didn't matter tomorrow, right? Like, let's just go have a ball.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Finally, if you could talk to your 20-year-old self, what would you tell them?
Stop wasting time and energy trying to control outcomes. You know, maybe other people don't, but I always try to control the outcome of a situation, right? Like I can control what I'm doing in this situation, but you try to control the outcome. So you try to see everybody's perspective, every opportunity, every, possible outcome and try to steer it in the way that you want. And at some point you just got to let it go and just let things happen the way that they're going to happen. So I tell my 20-year-old self, like, save yourself some stress, save yourself some energy and some time, and just stop trying to control the outcome and just let things happen and move on with it quickly.
That's good advice.
Okay, now let me ask you, I want to flip it real quick.
All right. Fair enough. Oh my gosh. Putting on the spot here.
This like the idea of like a perfect day or your last day is such a cool one, right? Like you really think about, okay, what is important to you? What means the most? What matters the most? So I want to know from you, like if you had the perfect day or it was your last day, like what would you do?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. I would probably like to spend that day in Costa Rica with my family at the beach. I also really like to make a point to be having some special time, one-on-one time with all of those people that means so much to me. My wife, my kids, my parents, my brother, my sister. Their families, and really just be there together, share some great meals, and enjoy some time looking at the sunset. That's how I would spend my day.
Yeah. It's amazing how it comes back to family and, like family and friends. It's why we do the things that we do, is to help other people. We want to serve other people, right? But we want to do that so that we can take care of our families. It's kind of cool. I've gotten super deep and reflective since my dad passed in 21. But man, when those questions come up, that's the first thing I think is like my dad, it's one of the coolest things ever. The last thing my dad said to my mom on his way out the door the day he passed was, "You are so beautiful. I am so lucky to have you." Like that's what my mom gets to remember about my dad forever, right? Like how cool is that? And he didn't know, right? He didn't have any kind of preemptive idea. It's just like you start to realize the time and energy, affection, like concentration you give to conversations. It makes everything so much more meaningful. I love that idea of like spending that one-on-one time with the people you love. I think that's awesome. It says a lot about who you are too.
I appreciate that. Well, to come full circle, we did talk a bit about, obviously what you do. And I don't know that we really hit super high level. And I think you'll be able to answer this really easy. It's like, why do you do it? Why do you do what you do?
Because I love to help people. I love to help people. I love being able to be part of their story. When I was a teacher, it was one of my favorite things to write on the end of the year report cards or in yearbooks it was an honor to be a small part in your life story. And to be able to do that for my clients, whether it be the beginning of their career or the end of their career, to be able to play that small part in their life story is such an honor that somebody's willing to trust you and to keep you in that position to help out. It's just, for me, that's that's the difference. Like you can make a real difference in somebody's life by doing that and by having them allow you into their life. That's why I do it.
That's really special. Again, I'm going to change the script and keep going if you have a couple more minutes, because it really comes back to something that I think about, because I don't know if you know this about me. I went to school for fine art. I actually have a bachelor's of art in painting. Actually, I first went to school for engineering, hated it, dropped out, and went to an art school, and then further have a master's in fine art, and it was like, it's kind of a terminal degree where it was like what I could do is teach, and I was like, teach? I want to be an artist. I don't want to teach, But as my 47-year-old self would like to probably tell my 20-some-year-old self, is the best when I'm at my best and when I am doing and following my heart, I'm teaching. Like whether it's my clients, my kids, or whatever, that's actually what I really like doing.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah. That's amazing. When people find out that I was a teacher, right? Because I taught for 11 years. So I taught in Charleston, South Carolina for 5, and then up here in Jenison, Michigan for 6. People are always like, "Oh, I could never do that." Yeah, I think you'd be amazed at how well you really would. Maybe not kids. Maybe it's older. Maybe it's like, instead of doing elementary, you would do middle school. Maybe if it's not middle school, maybe high school. If not high school, maybe college. Maybe adults. But you'd be amazed at how much you really have to give somebody. When you're willing to actually give of yourself, you're allowed to be more service oriented than selfish, and trying to control everything. But if you're service oriented, you have a lot to give to people, a lot of insight, a lot of, education, a lot of input, advice. People are really good at giving advice. They just don't think about it as teaching. But man, I've had some phenomenal teachers I've worked with, not only in the classroom, but in the real world, just out here working, right? I've had some great teachers that have taught me wonderful life lessons, whether it be hard ones or easy ones. But man, we all have something to give to others if we're just willing to kind of suck it up, be vulnerable, which is the biggest thing, right? Like you said, when I'm at my best, I'm teaching. Yeah, because you're giving of yourself and you're being vulnerable and you're willing to open your heart and share what you got. And when people do that, it makes a big difference in people's lives. I wish more people would do that. We've kind of shied away because of social media, because now everybody's got their own platform and like people sharing opinions on things that they shouldn't be sharing. But like, you do have something to tell me. I just want to know what it is where you really are at with your heart.
Well, I really appreciate this conversation and you taking the time to be here today. It's unfortunate my partner in crime, Remy, is not here with us, but maybe
he was smarter than us. He got out of the snow.
He did get out of the snow, didn't he? I mean, this is a cold week, but my heart is warm, and I really, with tons of gratitude, appreciate you being here with me, and thank you so much. Signing off.
Yeah, thank you.
See if I can figure out how to sign off. There we go.